On the night the chandeliers burned like captive suns above the marble ballroom, she stood near the wall where the servants' shadows gathered, wishing herself invisible. Music drifted through the gilded air, graceful and rehearsed, as silks whispered past her plain sleeves and jewels winked from elegant throats. She had been brought only to attend her employer's daughter, to mend a ribbon, fetch a shawl, and remain unnoticed among people who had perfected the art of not seeing her. Yet the room seemed determined to remind her that she did not belong. Miss Eliza Hartwell had learned, from years of quiet endurance, how to make herself small. Her gown was clean but modest, a dove-gray cotton that bore no embroidery, no daring cut, no invitation to attention. Her brown hair was arranged simply at the nape of her neck. She watched the dancers turn like living clockwork beneath painted ceilings and told herself that dignity required silence. She had no mother to advise her, no fortune to defend her, only her composure, which she guarded as fiercely as any noble guarded an estate. Across the room, near the hearth where the firelight gilded everything it touched, sat the Duke of Rathmore. Even in stillness he commanded attention. His dark coat was cut to perfection, his posture upright in the wheeled chair that had been his prison for 5 years. People avoided looking directly at him for too long, as if his misfortune were contagious. Whispers followed him everywhere, about the riding accident, about the physicians who had failed him, about the coldness that had settled into his temperament since the day he could no longer walk. They called him the Iron Duke, not for cruelty, but for the impenetrable reserve that shielded him from pity. Eliza had seen him only once before, from a distance in the garden. What struck her then, and struck her now, was not his disability but the intensity of his gaze. He observed the world as though he expected betrayal from it. His eyes moved across the dancers, across the laughing nobles, then paused, unexpectedly, on her. She dropped her gaze at once, startled by the sensation of being examined. A sudden ripple of laughter broke beside her. Lady Penworth, adorned in crimson satin and self-importance, swayed backward from a jest told too loudly. Her glass tipped. A cascade of dark wine splashed across Eliza's bodice, blooming like a wound against the gray fabric. "Oh!" Lady Penworth exclaimed without apology. "How unfortunate. One forgets these girls stand so very close." A few nearby guests chuckled. Someone murmured that governesses ought to learn invisibility as part of their training. Heat flooded Eliza's cheeks. She curtsied instinctively, whispering that it was nothing, though the stain spread quickly, undeniable. She turned to retreat, desperate for a corridor, a handkerchief, a place to breathe. Her slipper caught in the hem of her gown. The polished marble offered no mercy. She stumbled backward, arms flailing for balance that did not come. The fall felt endless and impossibly swift. Instead of striking the floor, she collided with warmth and solidity. A strong hand seized her waist. Another grasped her arm. She found herself seated abruptly upon the Duke's lap, her palms pressed against his chest, her breath stolen by shock. The music faltered into silence. For one suspended heartbeat, no one moved. Eliza's mind refused to comprehend where she was. She could feel the firm line of his shoulders beneath her fingers, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the scent of cedar and smoke clinging to his coat. She dared not look up. Then she felt it. The Duke's grip tightened. Not in alarm, but in something like resolve. A murmur began at the edges of the room. Someone gasped sharply. A glass shattered against the marble. Eliza realized, with dawning disbelief, that the Duke was no longer seated. He was standing. She felt the shift beneath her before she understood it. The strength in his arms changed from support to balance. Her feet touched the floor as he rose, still holding her, as if she were the only solid thing anchoring him to the earth. The wheeled chair rolled backward, abandoned. No one spoke. The orchestra players stared, bows suspended in air. A lady fainted softly into her husband's arms. The chandeliers hummed overhead, indifferent witnesses to the impossible. Eliza finally lifted her eyes to his. They were wide, dark, and alive with something that had not been there before. Not anger. Not pride. Something fiercer. Something awakening. His breath came unsteadily, as though he had run a great distance. His hands remained at her waist, not out of impropriety but necessity. She realized with a tremor of awe that he was trembling. He began, then stopped. His voice was deeper than she expected, and used yet commanding. The entire ballroom leaned toward him without meaning to. He lowered his head slightly so that only she could hear the next words, though the silence made them feel thunderous. "You're mine." The words did not sound like a declaration of possession, but of discovery, as though he had found something lost long ago. Yet to Eliza they struck like lightning. She could not breathe. She could not think. She could only stare at the man who should not have been able to stand, who now towered before her with fragile, miraculous steadiness. Around them, whispers erupted into chaos. Questions tumbled over one another. Physicians were called for. Ladies clutched their fans as though fending off hysteria. The Duke did not look at any of them. He looked only at her. As servants rushed forward and gentlemen demanded explanations, Eliza understood with dreadful clarity that her humiliation had transformed into something far more dangerous. She had not merely fallen into the Duke's lap. She had fallen into the center of a miracle that society would not forgive, would not understand, and would never allow her to escape. And still, his hands did not release her. Morning arrived at Rathmore beneath a sky the color of pewter, and with it came the sound Eliza dreaded most. Whispers traveling faster than footsteps through the corridors. Servants paused mid-task to exchange glances. Doors opened a fraction wider than necessary. The miracle of the ballroom had ripened overnight into scandal, and her name, once too insignificant to remember, now moved from mouth to mouth with alarming ease. She kept to her small chamber, scrubbing futilely at the wine stain that had dried into the fabric of her gown like a brand. Each rub of the cloth felt like an attempt to erase a moment the world refused to forget. She had slept little. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt again the strength of his hands, the impossible sensation of rising with him, the words that had been spoken so close to her ear that they seemed to echo from within her own chest. A knock sounded. Not timid, not hesitant. She opened the door to find a footman bearing a flat box of dark polished wood. He bowed with unfamiliar deference and presented it without explanation. Inside lay a shawl of the finest wool, soft as breath, dyed a deep midnight blue that shimmered faintly in the light. Folded atop it was a card bearing the Duke's seal. Her fingers trembled as she read the single line written in firm, deliberate script. "Tend me at noon." No apology. No elaboration. Only expectation. The household noticed when she crossed the gallery wearing the shawl. Eyes followed her as though she had adorned herself in a crown. A cook whispered that she must have ensnared him. A maid muttered that miracles were often born of impropriety. Eliza kept her chin lifted, though her stomach churned with dread and something far more dangerous, anticipation. She was shown into the Duke's private sitting room, where tall windows admitted a pale winter light. He stood near the hearth with the aid of a cane, his posture rigid with concentration. The sight of him upright stole her breath more than it had the night before. It was no illusion. He bore his weight carefully, like a man relearning the language of his own body. "Miss Hartwell," he said, turning toward her. His voice held steadiness now, though an undercurrent of effort betrayed him. She curtsied, unsure whether to look at his face or his legs, which seemed both miraculous and fragile. "You sent for me, Your Grace." "I did." His gaze traveled briefly to the shawl around her shoulders. "It suits you." She flushed, uncertain whether to thank him for the gift or resent the implication that she belonged in his notice at all. A silence settled, thick with all that could not be politely spoken. She felt again the memory of his hands at her waist and wondered if he did as well. "You may sit," he said at last, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "I find I prefer not to speak upward to people any more." She obeyed, noting the faint humor in his words. He lowered himself carefully into his own seat, the cane resting against his knee like a conquered adversary. "The physicians arrived this afternoon," he continued. "They are convinced I have been misdiagnosed for years. Society is convinced of something else entirely." Eliza clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "They are speaking of me, Your Grace." "Yes," he replied without softness. "They are." She swallowed. "I assure you I did not intend." "I know you did not," he interrupted. "Which is precisely why they will not believe it." His eyes held hers with unnerving intensity. She sensed he was studying not her face, but her reaction to being studied. "They mean to dismiss me," she said quietly. "Lady Harrowfield cannot endure the gossip." A shadow crossed his expression. "You will not leave this estate." She looked up sharply. "Your Grace." "You will remain here," he repeated, "as my personal reader." The words struck her with the force of a decree. "I am not qualified for such a position." "You read well," he said. "You speak plainly. You do not look at me with pity. Those are the only qualifications I require." She felt the precariousness of the situation closing around her. "People will think." "Let them think," he said, the steel returning to his tone. "They have always done so." She realized then that this was not an offer born of convenience. It was a decision shaped by something far more personal, far more deliberate. He was not rescuing her from dismissal. He was claiming her presence in his life with the same quiet certainty he had shown when he stood. A knock interrupted them. A servant entered to announce that callers had begun to arrive, eager to witness the Duke's recovery. The Duke's jaw tightened slightly. "They will parade through this room all afternoon," he said. "They will stare at my legs and speculate about my soul. You may remain if you wish and read to me while they observe." She hesitated, then nodded. As the first guests entered, she opened a book with hands that felt oddly steady. Her voice filled the room, calm and measured, while curious eyes darted between the page and the Duke's posture. He listened not to the words she read, but to the cadence of her speech, as though it anchored him against the scrutiny. Hours passed in this strange tableau. By the time the last visitor departed, dusk had settled against the windows like a patient witness. Eliza closed the book. The Duke had not once asked her to stop. "Why?" she asked softly. He regarded her for a long moment. "Because when you speak, the room forgets to stare at me." The admission lingered between them, intimate and unguarded. She felt something shift inside her, an understanding that this arrangement was no longer about scandal, nor even about gratitude. It was about a connection neither of them had sought, yet both now felt the weight of. As she rose to leave, he added quietly, "You will dine here tomorrow evening. Alone." Her heart stumbled. "Your Grace, that would not be proper." He met her gaze without apology. "Miss Hartwell, nothing about us has been proper since the moment you fell." Rain arrived before dusk, whispering first against the tall library windows and then drumming with steady insistence, as though the sky itself wished to confine the world indoors. Eliza sat near the fire with an unopened book resting in her lap, listening to the storm claim the estate corridor by corridor. The servants had retreated early, the lamps burned lower, and Rathmore seemed suspended in a hush that felt both intimate and perilous. She had come to dine as instructed. The meal had passed in strained civility, silverware touching porcelain with exaggerated politeness while unspoken questions hovered between them like invisible guests. Now the table was cleared, the door closed, and only the Duke remained across from her, seated in a high-backed chair with the cane resting within reach, though he had not touched it for nearly an hour. "You are uneasy," he observed. She did not deny it. "The storm makes the house feel smaller." "Or perhaps," he replied quietly, "it removes the world that watches us." The firelight traced amber along the planes of his face, softening the severity she had first associated with him. Without the gaze of society upon him, he seemed less like a figure carved from iron and more like a man reacquainting himself with warmth. She noticed how carefully he balanced his feet upon the rug, as though still negotiating with the miracle that had returned them to him. "I ought not to have come," she said, though without conviction. "You came because you wished to," he answered. She lowered her eyes, startled by the truth of it. A crack of thunder sounded overhead, closer than before. The lamps flickered. The room dimmed into deeper shadows, leaving only the fire to define the space between them. The air felt charged, thick with rain and possibility. He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something of yourself that society would consider unworthy of mention." She blinked. "Why would you wish to know that?" "Because I am weary of hearing only what society finds worthy." She hesitated, then spoke softly. "My father was a bookbinder. He died with ink on his hands and debt in his pockets. I learned to read by mending torn pages he brought home. I have never owned a gown that was not second-hand." The confession seemed to steady her rather than shame her. The Duke listened without interruption, his gaze intent but not unkind. "I was raised to believe I must never be noticed," she continued. "That safety lies in being overlooked." He regarded her for a long moment. "And yet, you are the most impossible person in this house to overlook." She felt the heat rise to her cheeks again, though this time it was not humiliation that fueled it. He drew a slow breath. "May I offer you a truth in return?" She nodded. "The night you fell into my arms, I did not stand because of surprise. I stood because, for the first time in years, I wished to reach toward something instead of retreat from it." Her heart quickened painfully. "Your Grace." "I had grown accustomed to stillness," he continued, his voice low. "Stillness of body, stillness of feeling. I had accepted that my life would be observed, not lived. And then you collided with me like a force of nature, unguarded, uncalculated. You looked at me not as a duke, not as a cripple, but as a man you had accidentally inconvenienced." Despite herself, she laughed softly. "That look," he said, watching her closely, "was the first honest thing I had seen in years." Silence settled between them, no longer strained but delicate, like the pause before a confession neither could undo. She closed the distance by rising from her chair to place another log upon the fire. When she turned back, he was watching her with an expression she could not name but felt deeply. "Do you regret what happened?" he asked. She considered the question with care. "I regret the humiliation. I do not regret the moment." His gaze darkened, as though her words had struck something unguarded within him. Without quite knowing why, she stepped closer. He did not move away. The fire crackled, rain battered the windows, and the world outside seemed very far removed from the small space they now shared. He reached for her hand slowly, deliberately, giving her time to withdraw. She did not. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. The contact sent a tremor through her that had nothing to do with cold. "You did not heal my legs," he said quietly. "You awakened my will." The words settled over her like a benediction. She felt the truth of them, felt the weight of what it meant to be seen not as a scandal, but as a catalyst for life. Their faces were nearer now than propriety allowed. She could see the faint silver at his temples, the intensity that had softened into something almost vulnerable. "Miss Hartwell," he murmured. "Yes, Your Grace. I fear what will happen to you because of me." She understood at once. Society would not forgive proximity. It would twist every glance, every meeting, into proof of impropriety. "I have endured whispers before," she said. "Not like these." A sound in the corridor startled them apart. Footsteps passed, then faded. The interruption felt like a reminder of the world waiting just beyond the door, ready to intrude. He released her hand reluctantly. "They will not allow this to continue without consequence." She stepped back, her pulse still racing. "Then perhaps it should not continue." He looked at her sharply. "Is that what you wish?" She did not answer, because the truth, newly awakened within her, frightened her more than scandal ever could. The storm intensified, rattling the windows with sudden violence. The fire flared brightly, casting their shadows large and intertwined upon the wall behind them. He rose slowly to his feet without the cane, crossing the small distance between them with careful determination. She watched each step as though witnessing another miracle unfold in silence. When he stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, he spoke with a quiet gravity that made her breath catch. "Tomorrow," he said, "I must decide whether to ruin you or save you." Construction. Fractured beams across the gallery. Eliza Hartwell stood near the hearth, the folds of her modest gray gown pressed neatly, though her pulse refused the same composure. The household had grown accustomed to her presence at the Duke's side, yet the murmurs persisted. Each footfall in the corridor felt like a herald of gossip, each shadow along the walls a silent observer to her precarious place. Today, however, would not be governed by whispers. Today the Duke would act. The Duke of Rathmore entered the gallery with a measured gait that seemed almost ceremonial. The cane rested against his wrist, though he no longer required its support. His eyes, dark and commanding, swept across the room, resting for a moment too long upon her. That glance, heavy with possession and intention, made the room shrink until it contained only the two of them. The orchestra of society could play on behind the walls, but here, in this sanctuary of marble and firelight, there existed only him and the quiet strength she had learned to summon. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice low and firm. "Walk with me." She nodded, heart fluttering with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. The servants had disappeared, the corridors emptied, and the gallery's echo carried each footstep like a drumbeat marking a confrontation yet to come. She followed as he led her toward the main hall, his posture perfect, his movements precise, as though each step had been practiced in private solitude for years. That precision, once a symbol of restraint, now felt like a promise of something more deliberate, something both unnerving and enthralling. The hall beyond the gallery was crowded, though no one noticed her arrival. Society had gathered in polite assembly, eager to witness the Duke's public recovery, to see the man who had lain broken now stand whole. Ladies in silks and gentlemen in polished coats clustered in discreet groups, murmuring among themselves. Gossip swirled like autumn leaves in a tempest. Their eyes, sharp with expectation, sought proof of miracle or scandal. Eliza's steps faltered slightly as she sensed the room's anticipation. The Duke, unshaken, offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. She exhaled and regained composure. Each movement became deliberate, each gesture purposeful, as if she and he were partners in a silent negotiation of dignity and defiance. He stopped near the center of the hall, leaving her a mere pace behind. The crowd sensed a shift, a stillness that demanded attention. The Duke removed the cane from his wrist and let it fall gently to the floor. A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. "I stand," he declared, voice carrying through the hall, "without aid, without hesitation. Those who doubted my recovery may now see that strength is not always visible from the outset." Eyes widened, whispers multiplied, and a lady near the front clutched her fan as though it could shield her from disbelief. The Duke's gaze, however, did not move toward the audience. It remained fixed, unyielding, upon Eliza. "You," he said, his words measured, deliberate, "are under my protection." A murmur of shock swept the hall. Protection in Rathmore society was a term laden with expectation and scandal. Eliza's cheeks warmed, a mixture of fear and the faintest thrill rising within her. She could see the unspoken question in the eyes of every attendee. Why her? How had she, a governess of modest means and muted presence, earned such distinction from a man who had once been untouchable, both in body and reputation? "Your Grace," she began, voice soft but steady, "this attention." "Attention," he interrupted smoothly, "is what they will offer. What they choose to believe is theirs. I am here to define what is true." His hand extended subtly toward hers. The room seemed to shrink further, narrowing to a single axis of connection between them. Hesitation flickered in her mind, yet she did not withdraw. The warmth of his fingers upon hers carried a certainty that no society decree could contest. She understood that this was no longer a private arrangement, no longer merely the result of accident or necessity. It was deliberate, public, and irrevocable. He led her through the hall to a raised dais, placing her slightly behind him yet within the view of the assembly. He straightened fully, the elegance of his posture amplified by the knowledge that every eye was upon him. Then he did the unexpected. He knelt, not with supplication, but with an intentional display of reverence, and took her hand in both of his. "Do you see, Miss Hartwell," he said, voice low but resonant, "that the world will not dictate the measure of your worth?" Her pulse throbbed, the words stirring something long dormant. She had endured whispers, scorn, and isolation for so long that the gravity of his declaration threatened to overwhelm her. Yet in that moment, amidst the astonishment of the assembly, she felt an affirmation that transcended fear, a recognition that she was seen, wholly, without apology or concealment. A cry of indignation rose from the gallery's edge. Lady Penworth, crimson once more, trembled with righteous outrage. "This is preposterous. A governess in the Duke's company, standing as if she were a noblewoman herself. I demand explanation." The Duke's hand tightened slightly over hers. "Explanation is unnecessary. Observation is optional. Miss Hartwell's presence is my decree, her worth beyond your judgment." His eyes swept the assembly, dark and unwavering. "And let it be known, she has my favor, my trust, and my protection. Anyone who seeks to challenge it will do so at their peril." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. The murmurs died into reluctant awe, tempered by scandal. Eyes that had once scrutinized now watched, apprehensive yet compelled. Eliza felt the enormity of the moment press against her chest, yet she did not flinch. She had been claimed, not by society, but by the man who had restored his own life through her accidental touch. The irony was exquisite, almost cruel, but it carried the weight of undeniable truth. He rose from the dais, still holding her hand, and led her down the hall. The crowd parted with murmurs of astonishment. Eliza's steps were careful, measured, yet she walked with an unfamiliar confidence, one born not from defiance but from recognition of her own value. She realized that the humiliation she had endured, the whispering doubts of her modest origin, had been transformed into a crucible through which she had emerged irrevocably changed. The Duke paused near the staircase, releasing her hand for a moment to gesture toward the gathered assembly. "Let them talk," he said, voice carrying a quiet ferocity. "Let them see what is impossible to ignore. She is mine, and this declaration shall not be retracted." Her gaze met his, and she felt the full weight of intention in those dark eyes. Possession, protection, devotion. He had combined them all into a single silent edict that left no room for hesitation. She understood, in a way she had not before, that the world beyond these walls could oppose, whisper, and conspire, yet within this house, within his sphere, nothing could diminish what had been forged in the fire of accident, courage, and awakening desire. As the last of the guests filed from the hall, murmuring with speculation and barely contained outrage, the Duke drew her aside into the solitude of the library. Rain streaked the windows, tapping a staccato rhythm against the glass. The firelight flickered across their faces, painting them in hues of warmth and shadow. Tomorrow, he said softly, yet with unmistakable gravity, we confront the world again. Tonight, we claim what has been ours since the moment I stood. Eliza swallowed hard, a mixture of fear and anticipation curling in her chest. She realized that this was only the beginning, the first act of a story that society would neither forgive nor forget, and yet a story that, for once, belonged entirely to them. The storm outside raged on, echoing the storm within her, and in that shared silence she felt the impossible certainty that their fates, once accidental, were now deliberately entwined. The ballroom had emptied of its revelers, leaving only the faint glow of candlelight to flicker across the gilded walls. Emma's heart raced as she stepped cautiously among the shadows, her silk gown whispering against the marble floor. Every nerve in her body screamed that she was close, that the moment she had dreaded and dreamed of had arrived. She had come for answers, for the truth, but above all, she had come for him. At the far end of the hall, where the music had once swept the crowd into a frenzy of laughter and waltz, he sat alone. The Duke's chair was positioned at an angle that caught the moonlight streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the sharp lines of his face and the subtle tremor in his hand. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished by absence, yet commanding attention in a way only he could. Emma's breath caught. The years of longing, anger, and hope condensed into a single electric heartbeat. He looked up and the world shifted. The same piercing blue eyes that had haunted her dreams now locked onto hers with a mixture of astonishment and something darker, something possessive and untamed. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them thickened, dense with unspoken words and buried emotions. Emma's mind raced, recalling every cruel slight, every whispered promise, every desperate plea she had made in silence. "Emma," he said finally, his voice hoarse but commanding, carrying across the room like a challenge and a confession all at once. He gestured slightly toward the space before him, and she froze. Was a test, or perhaps an invitation? She hesitated, her pulse hammering in her ears. The truth of the Duke's condition was undeniable. His once limp frame now appeared steady, almost impossibly so. Yet she had been trained to doubt, to protect herself. Her gaze swept the room, noting the subtle scars of his suffering, the taut line of his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes. Every detail told her he had fought, clawed, and endured in ways he had never revealed. And then it happened. Her foot slipped on the marble, her balance betrayed by the swish of her gown. She fell forward, caught entirely by instinct, and landed in his lap. Time fractured in that moment. The Duke's arms wrapped around her with a strength that betrayed his previous frailty. His eyes widened, a flash of shock followed by raw, unfiltered desire. He drew a slow, controlled breath, as if the act of holding her, truly holding her, had ignited something long dormant within him. "You're mine," he said, low and absolute, and the words struck Emma like a bolt of lightning. There was no question, no hesitation, only the certainty of ownership and devotion wrapped together in one fierce declaration. Her chest tightened. For years she had imagined revenge, reconciliation, escape, but none of them felt real against the intensity of his gaze. He studied her face, memorizing every flicker of fear and recognition, every subtle reaction. And in that unspoken scrutiny, Emma realized the truth. He had changed. Or perhaps she had. Perhaps they had both been molded by suffering into versions of themselves capable of seeing each other fully, flawed, scarred, yet breathtakingly alive. The Duke leaned back slightly, keeping her in his arms, his hand tracing the curve of her shoulder as though testing the reality of her presence. "You think you can resist me," he murmured, a hint of a challenge lacing his tone. "But the truth is, Emma, you never could." She shivered, torn between indignation and something more primal. Her hands rested lightly on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a rhythm that had once seemed broken beyond repair. She began, but her words failed her. Nothing in her rehearsed speeches, nothing in her careful plotting, could capture the torrent of emotion that surged through her. His laughter, low and rough, filled the room, shattering the tension with the promise of intimacy and dominance. "Say nothing," he commanded. "Just stay. Let me prove it." Emma's mind spun, memories of humiliation and longing colliding in a dizzying swirl. She had fought for years to reclaim her dignity, to resist him, to escape the gravity of the man who had dominated her youth. And yet here she was, not resisting at all, suspended between fear and desire, vulnerability and trust. Slowly he rose from the chair, carrying her effortlessly in his arms. The movement was fluid, assured, the very image of regained power. Every step he took resonated through her, each heartbeat echoing the years of anticipation and unspoken tension between them. Emma's fingers brushed against the fine embroidery of his coat, tracing the symbols of nobility and burden alike. She realized then that his strength was not merely physical. It was the culmination of pain, patience, and a relentless will. He set her down gently, yet there was no slack in his control. She met his gaze, seeing the reflection of herself, defiant, passionate, untamed. "Do you understand?" he asked softly, though his eyes burned with an intensity that made her knees weak. "You belong to me, Emma. Not because I demand it, but because you chose me the moment you could have turned away." Her lips parted, trembling, and she searched for the words that would encapsulate the storm within her. I don't know if I could have," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now, I think I could never leave." The Duke's hand cupped her cheek, tilting her face up to meet his. The intensity of his gaze was a living thing, a force that drew her in with inexorable gravity. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every moment to retreat, yet she remained rooted in the certainty of their connection. And when their lips finally met, it was a collision of pent-up longing, fierce need, and the unspoken acknowledgement of years lost to pride and circumstance. The kiss broke, leaving them both breathless, yet somehow more anchored than ever. Emma rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that matched her own. In that silence they found understanding. The past could not be undone, but the future, this reclaimed, electrifying future, was theirs to command. "You have no idea what you've done to me," he whispered, his lips brushing her temple. "I thought I'd lost you forever. But now," his voice dropped and the possessive edge returned. "Now you're mine. In every sense that matters." Emma smiled, a mixture of triumph and surrender lighting her features. "Then let's not waste any more time," she said, her fingers entwining with his. "If you can walk, then let's run, together." The Duke chuckled, a sound that vibrated with triumph and relief. He extended his hand, inviting her to move forward, to leave the hall, the past, and the pain behind. Emma took it without hesitation, feeling the surge of vitality in his step, the certainty in his stance, the promise of a life rewritten. And as they moved toward the door, bathed in the silvery glow of moonlight, the shadows of old betrayals and lost years seemed to dissolve. In the quiet triumph of that night, in the thrill of reclaimed strength and newfound unity, the Duke and Emma became not just survivors, but victors in a story that had tested the limits of love, patience, and human resilience. The final glance they shared, lingering yet unspoken, sealed the unbreakable bond forged in fire and vulnerability. Whatever the world had taken from them before, it could not touch the certainty they now held in each other's arms. In that moment, Emma knew without question that the man who had once been crippled was now whole, and that she, too, had found her place, irrevocably, undeniably by his side. The doors opened, the night air rushing in like a cleansing tide, and they stepped out together. He fully restored in strength and spirit, she fully awakened to the power of love's relentless claim. And as the moonlight traced their silhouettes, one truth lingered above all else. No force in the world could ever undo what they had finally discovered in each other.